We were hit by a tiny comet, admitted Eric, who was looking a little sheepish. Sorry, everyone. I didn't mean for that to happen. A tiny what? Asked George, feeling the room spin around him. Eric typed a few more commands into Cosmos. I think that's enough for today, said George. Are you all right, George? He took off his glasses and peered into George's face. You look a little green. He sounded worried. Oh, dear, I thought this was going to be fun, Annie, he called to the kitchen. Can you bring George a glass of water? Oh, dear, oh, dear. Annie came in, walking on tiptoe. She was carefully holding a full teacup of water, some of which was sloshing over the side. Freddie the pig was glued to her side, casting adoring glances up at her with his piggy eyes. She held the cup out to George. Don't worry, she said kindly. I felt really sick, too, my first time. Dad, it was a command. It's time to let George go home now. He's had enough of the universe. Yes, I think you're right, said Eric, still looking concerned. But it was so interesting, protested George. I can't see it. Can't I see some more? No, really, I think that's enough, said Eric, hurriedly, putting on a coat. I'm going to walk you back to your house now. Cosmos, you're in charge of Annie for a couple of minutes. Come on, George, bring your pig. Can I come back? Said George eagerly. Eric stopped fussing around with coats and keys and outdoor shoes and smiled. Certainly, he said. But you must promise not to tell anyone about Cosmos, Annie added. It's a secret? I asked George eagerly. Yes, said Annie. It's a huge, great big, ginormous, amazing secret that has 1,000,000,000,000 gazillion times bigger than any secret you've ever heard before. Now, Annie, said Eric sternly, I've told you that gazillion is not a real number. Say goodbye to George and his pig. Annie waved and gave George a smile. Goodbye, George, said Cosmo's voice. Thank you for making use of my exceedingly powerful capacities. Thank you, Cosmo, said George politely. With that, Eric ushered him and Freddie into the hallway and out the front door and back to their real lives on planet Earth. Chapter 6. The next day at school, George couldn't stop thinking about the wonders he had seen at Eric's house. Enormous clouds and outer space and flying rocks. Cosmos, the world's most powerful computer, and they all lived next door to him. George, the boy whose parents wouldn't even let him have an ordinary computer in the house. The excitement was almost too much to bear, especially now that George was sitting once more at his very boring desk in the classroom. He doodled on the school book in front of him with his colored pencils, trying to sketch Eric's amazing computer, the one that could make window from thin air, and through that window show you the birth and death of a star. But even though George could see it perfectly in his mind, his hand found it difficult to draw a picture that looked anything like what he had seen. It was very annoying. He had to keep crossing parts out and drawing them again until the whole page looked like one giant squiggle. Ow! He exclaimed suddenly when a missile made of a scrunched up ball of paper hit him on the back of the head. Ah, George, said Dr. Reaper, his teacher, so you are with us this afternoon after all. How nice. George looked up with a start. Dr. Reaper was standing right over him, staring down through his really smeared glasses. There was a large blue ink stain on his jacket which reminded George of the shape of an exploding star. Do you have anything to say to the class, Dr. Reaper? Said Dr. Reaper, peering down at George's notebook, which George hastily tried to cover. Other than that, ow! The only word I've heard you say today? No, not really, said George in a strangled, high-pitched voice. You wouldn't like to say, Dr. Reaper, dear Dr. Reaper, here is the homework I spent all weekend slaving over. Well, said George, embarrassed. Or, Dr. Reaper, I've listened carefully to every word you've said in class, written them all down, added my own comments, and here's my project, with which you will be extremely pleased. Muttered George, wondering how to get out of this one. Of course you wouldn't, said Dr. Reaper heavily. After all, I'm just the teacher, and I stand here all day saying things for my own amusement and fun, with no hope that anyone will ever gain anything of value from my attempts to educate them. I do listen, protested George, who was now feeling guilty. Don't try and flatter me, said Dr. Reaper, rather wildly. It won't work. He whipped around sharply and give me that. He shot across the classroom so fast he was almost a blur of speed and snatched a cell phone away from a boy sitting in the back. Dr. Reaper might wear tweed jackets, and speak like a man from a century ago, but his pupils were so scared of him, they never tricked him the way they did teachers who were foolish enough to try to befriend them. He was a new teacher, and he hadn't been at the school long, but even on his first day, he had quelled a whole room full of students into silence just by staring at them. There was nothing modern or touchy-feely or cozy about Dr. Reaper, with the result that his classrooms were always orderly, his homework came in on time, and even the slouchy rebel boy sat up straight and fell quiet when he walked into the room. The kids called him Greeper, a nickname that came from the sign of his office door, which read Dr. G. Reaper, or Greeper the Creeper, because of his mysterious habit of appearing without warning in far-flung corners of the school. There would be a gentle swoosh of thick-soled shoes and a faint smell of old tobacco, and before anyone knew it, Greeper would be bearing down on whatever secret mischief was brewing, rubbing his scarred hands with delight. No one knew how he had managed to cover both hands in red, scaly, painful-looking burn marks, and no one would ever dare ask. "Perhaps, George," said Greeper, pocketing the cell phone he had just confiscated, "you would care to enlighten the class as to what the artwork you have been working on this morning represents." "Oh, it's, whispered George, feeling his ears become hot and pink. "Speak up, boy, speak up," ordered Greeper. "We're all curious to know quite what this," he held up George's drawing of Cosmos so the whole class could see, "is meant to be, aren't we, class?" The other children snickered, delighted that Greeper was picking on someone who wasn't them. At that moment, George really hated Greeper. He hated him so much he completely forgot his fear of shame or humiliation in front of other pupils. Unfortunately, he also forgot his promise to Eric. "It's a very special computer, actually," he said in a loud voice, "which can show you what's happening in the universe. It belongs to my friend Eric." He fixed Greeper with a very blue stare, his eyes determined under his tufts of dark red hair. "There are amazing things in outer space just flying around all the time, like planets and stars and gold and stuff." George was making the last part up. Eric hadn't said anything about gold in outer space. For the first time since George had been in Greeper's class, his teacher seemed lost for words. He just stood there, holding George's book in his hands, his jaw falling open as he looked at George in wonder. "So it does work, after all," he half-whispered to George. "And you've seen it? That's amazing!" A moment later, it seemed as though Greeper were waking from a dream. He snapped George's book shut and handed it back to him, and walked to the front of the class. "Now," said Greeper loudly, "given today's behavior, I'm going to assign 100 lines. I want you to write neatly and clearly in your books. I will not send text messages in Dr. Reaper's class because I am too busy listening to all the interesting things he has to say. 100 times, please. And anyone who hasn't finished by the time the bell rings can stay behind." "Very good. Get on with it." There was an angry mutter from the classroom. George's classmates had been looking forward to seeing him being taken into pieces by the teacher, and instead they'd all been punished for something quite different, and George had mostly been let off the hook. "But, sir, that's not fair," whined a boy in the back. "Neither is life," replied Greeper happily, "as that is one of the most useful lessons I could possibly teach you. I feel proud that you've understood it already. Carry on with class." With that, he sat down at his desk, got out a book that was full of complicated equations, and started flicking through the pages, nodding to himself wisely as he did so. George felt a ruler being jabbed into his back. "This is all your fault," hissed Ringo, the class bully, who was sitting behind him. "Silence!" thundered Greeper, without even looking up from his book. "Anyone who speaks will do 200 lines instead." His hand whizzed across the page. George finished the 100 lines in his neat writing just as the bell rang for the end of class. Carefully, he tore out the page with the picture of Cosmos on it and folded it up, tucking it into a back pants pocket before dropping his book on Greeper's desk. But George hadn't taken even 2 steps down the hall before Greeper caught up with him and barred his way. "George," said Greeper very seriously, "this computer is real, isn't it? You've seen it, haven't you?" The look in his eyes was frightening. I was just, making things up, said George quickly, trying to wriggle away. He wished he hadn't said anything at all to Grieper. Where is it, George? Asked his teacher, speaking slowly and quietly. It's very important that you tell me where this amazing computer lives. There is no computer, said George, managing to duck under Grieper's arm. It doesn't exist. I just imagined it, that's all. Dr. Grieper drew back and looked at George thoughtfully. Be careful, George, he said with a scarily quiet voice. Be very careful. And with that, he walked away. Sorry this was in 3 videos. Thanks for listening.